Next, Washington, D.C. has been overtaken by violent gangs, bloodthirsty criminals and drugged-out maniacs. That's according to the U.S. president. Donald Trump says he's placing the city under direct federal control and deploying 800 National Guard troops there as he vows to tackle violent crime, which statistics show has actually fallen. Trump claims that Washington, D.C. performs poorly on safety relative to the capitals of Iraq, Brazil and Colombia. He also says his administration has begun removing homeless encampments. Let's hear a little of what he had to say.
Our capital city has been overtaken by violent gangs and bloodthirsty criminals, roving mobs of wild youth, drugged out maniacs and homeless people. And we're not going to let it happen anymore. We're not going to take it. We have other cities also that are bad, very bad. You look at Chicago, how bad it is. You look at Los Angeles, how bad it is. And this will go further. We're starting very strongly with D.C., and we're going to clean it up real quick.
The president has used his social media and White House megaphones to message that his administration is tough on crime, yet his ability to shape policy might be limited outside Washington, which has a unique status as a congressionally established federal district. Well, for more, we're joined now by legal analyst and former prosecutor Eric Lisann. Eric, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. We heard some very strong words from Donald Trump throughout that lengthy press briefing. He's suggesting Washington is essentially one of the most dangerous cities on the planet. Has there actually been a spike in violent crime there? And if not, as statistics appear to suggest, why is Trump saying all of this?
He's saying it for political gain. Thank you, by the way, for having me on. Trump has always sought to do things for the appearance of what they might convey to his wider audience, specifically to a wider base that doesn't live or have familiarity with the city of Washington, D.C., or many of these other large cities. So this is consistent with that type of messaging, and it's consistent with his type of desire to show that he's a strong man and that only he can fix it. Washington, D.C. presents a somewhat unique situation because, as you mentioned, in the Constitution of the United States, it is singled out as a federal district, or at least a portion of it could be singled out as a federal district. And there's some ambiguity in exactly what the limits of congressional power are and what would need to be done by amending the Constitution and things like this. But that leaves a lot of gray areas, and that's why Trump is seemingly using it first as a laboratory to what he might do in other cities where his power might be a little bit less clear-cut. We saw some of this in Los Angeles last month, and now we're seeing it taken apparently to another level right now.
Yeah, because as you say, it's not the first time that Trump has been critical of Democratic-run city administrations. Is that also what this is really about? You know, he's also talking about taking this plan to the streets of New York and Chicago.
It absolutely seems to be an attack on Democratic-run cities and a way for him to sort of exercise his and flex his newfound authority. And so far, the city leaders in Washington, D.C., at least, have been very accommodating to him on that. We'll have to see what happens in other cities and in other states where, of course, California, Gavin Newsom, in contrast, has been very much opposed and doing everything he can to oppose it. I don't know if that's going to be a change in the situation here, where the city in Washington, D.C., where the city leaders have been compliant up until now, but it has every earmark or hallmark of an attempt to impose political authority on a district or an area where he needs to assert his power because he's not accepted as legitimate or not popularly supported.
And as you say, Eric, these kind of threats that we're seeing coming from Donald Trump, they're highlighting how Washington, D.C.'s relationship with the federal government actually restricts its autonomy. So talk to us a little bit more, for viewers perhaps outside the United States, about what makes the city so unique and why has it become such a target for Republicans?
Yes, it has a very unique and complex relationship. It starts with the description of it in the Constitution itself, which says that it shall be a federal district. And as far as that goes, it makes a certain amount of sense. But for that reason, it was never part of a state, as it was seen to be an area where only the government would be the business. Over time, of course, that has changed. There's over 700,000 people that live in the city proper right now, and it's bigger than some states, and it contributes to the federal fisc more money than most states, certainly more money per capita. So much has obviously changed necessarily since the Constitution was written. But because of that language, the federal government up until 1973 governed the city directly. And what we now call today home rule was only established in 1973, but that still gives Congress the power to oversee and do very many things. The other side of that coin is that because DC isn't a state, it doesn't have any real representation in the federal legislature. So it has become, to many that live there, the embodiment of the revolutionary slogan, no taxation without representation, in that it has extensive taxation and it has no representation. The Home Rule Act of 1973 was designed to address that, and it has not been without some problems, but there has been since then a clear trend to devolve upon the city more powers to govern itself. And in many ways, it was largely self-governing up until now. But Trump is now in one fell swoop seeking to reverse that, and in a very draconian way, with federal law enforcement that is not at all trained for this kind of city policing function. So there's an enormous potential for not just risk, but actual danger to city residents because of this that did not exist before.
Yeah, and you mentioned all the grey areas that arise from this. The deployment of these National Guard troops to LA, that became the subject of a legal battle, hasn't quite yet played out in the courts. So is this actually lawful, what Donald Trump is announcing today?
I think arguably it is not lawful because the stated rationale for this does not match up with the reality on the ground. And while some deference has to be given, and the courts are falling all over themselves to give that deference to presidential findings and assertions of what is or isn't a national emergency or a local emergency that would justify this sort of deployment of the National Guard. But there is here a contrast that I think a court could be cognizant of and say, this does not justify the extreme measures that are being put into place here. But note that he's not actually yet involving the military itself. The National Guard has a sort of hybrid character, so it falls outside of other legislation, such as the Posse Comitatus Act. But it nonetheless is really pushing the limits, particularly as Trump is also, in a very radical move, stating that he is going to assert direct authority over the local police. He's already appointed a federal official to do that. I think this is testing very much the limits of his power, at least, if not constitutionally, at least under the Home Rule Act of 1973. So now we're going to be back into the courts. I'm almost certain to see how much of this is really going to be permitted by those courts.
Eric, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for being with us, though. That is legal analyst and former US prosecutor Eric Lisann.